Hello, everybody. This is Mike History 2, and I'm finally finished school, which means I can make some more, actually, a lot more videos. Um, Actually, I did finish school on Wednesday, but I've been pretty busy since then. So I haven't been able to make a video till today. But anyways, I'll be talking about once again, Joseph Stalin, and I think this is part 5 of Stalin versus Trotsky. So, in June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, starting the war on the Eastern Front. Despite having been warned, Stalin was taken by surprise. Idiot. The German tactic of blitzkrieg was initially highly effective, and the Soviet Air Force in the western borderlands was destroyed within 2 days. The German army pushed deep into Soviet territory, and soon Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states were under German occupation. Soviet refugees flooded into Moscow and Leningrad to escape the German army, although there were other Soviet citizens, mostly those who were either Russian or Jewish, who welcomed the German army as liberators, but they soon found that the Germans regarded them as subhumans who were only fit for economic exploitation. By July, Germany's force was bombing Moscow, and by October, the army was preparing for a full assault on the capital. Plans were made for the Soviet government to evacuate to Kuibyshev, although Stalin decided to remain in Moscow, believing that his flight would damage troop morale. The German advance on Moscow was stopped by the arrival of winter. Against his general's advice, Stalin emphasized attack over defense, because, yeah, that's what you do when you're being invaded. In June 1941, he ordered a scorched earth policy of destroying infrastructure and food supplies before the Germans could seize them, also commanding the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs to kill around 100,000 political prisoners in areas the German army occupied. Because, that's your main priority, right? He purged the military command, and several high ranking figures were demoted or reassigned, but a few were arrested and executed. Stalin commanded soldiers risking capture to commit suicide or fight to the death, and that those who allowed themselves to be captured were traitors, and among those taken as prisoners of war by the Germans was Stalin's own son, Yakov, who died in their custody. What a great father. In July 1942, Stalin ordered that those retreating would be placed in penal battalions used as cannon fodder on the front lines. The Soviet Union allied with the United Kingdom and the United States, and although the United States joined the war against Germany in 1941, little direct help reached the Soviet Union until late 1942. Responding to the invasion, the Soviets intensified their industry in central Russia, focusing almost entirely on production for the military. During the war, Stalin was more tolerant of the Russian Orthodox Church, allowing it to resume some of its activities and meeting with Patriarch Sergius of Moscow in September 1943. He also permitted a wider range of cultural expression, notably letting formerly suppressed writers and artists to spread their work more widely. The Internationale was dropped as the country's national anthem to be replaced with a more patriotic replacement. Comintern was dissolved in 1943, and Stalin encouraged foreign communist parties to emphasize nationalism over internationalism to broaden their domestic appeal. The Soviet government also began to increasingly promote pan-Slavist sentiment. Stalin exploited Nazi anti-Semitism, and in April 1942 he sponsored the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee to foster Jewish and foreign support for the Soviet war effort. In April 1942, Stalin ordered the Soviet Union's first serious counterattack, an attempt to seize German-held Kharkov in eastern Ukraine. This attack proved unsuccessful. That year, Hitler shifted his primary goal from an immediate victory in the east to the more long-term goal of securing the southern Soviet Union to conquer oil fields vital to a long-term German war effort. While the Red Army generals saw evidence that Hitler would shift efforts south, Stalin the genius considered this to be a flanking campaign in efforts to take Moscow. In June 1942, the German army attacked Stalingrad, and Stalin ordered the Red Army to hold the city at all costs. This resulted in the Battle of Stalingrad. In December 1942, he placed Konstantin Rokossovsky in charge of holding the city. In February 1943, the German troops attacking Stalingrad surrendered. The Soviet victory marked a major turning point in the war. By November 1942, the Soviets had begun to repulse the important German strategic southern campaign, and although there were 2.5 million Soviet casualties in that effort only, it allowed the Soviets to take the offensive for most of the rest of the war on the Eastern Front. Germany attempted an encirclement attack at Kursk, which was successfully repulsed by the Soviets. By the end of 1943, Soviets reconquered half of the territory taken by the Germans from 1941 to 1942. In Allied countries, Stalin was increasingly depicted in a positive light over the course of the war. In 1942, Time magazine named him the Man of the Year. However, there remained mutual suspicions between Stalin, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and American President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who were known as the Big Three. Churchill flew to Moscow to visit Stalin in August 1942 and again in October 1944. Stalin barely left Moscow throughout the war, with Roosevelt and Churchill frustrated with his reluctance to travel to meet them. In November 1943, Stalin met with Churchill and Roosevelt in Tehran, a location of Stalin's choosing. There, Stalin and Roosevelt got on well, with both desiring the post-war destruction of most of the United Kingdom's territory. At Tehran, the trio agreed that to prevent Germany from becoming a strong military power again, Germany should be broken up. Roosevelt and Churchill also agreed to Stalin's demand that the German city of Königsberg be declared Soviet territory. Stalin was impatient for the United States and the United Kingdom to open up a Western front to take pressure off the East, and they eventually did so in mid-1944. Stalin insisted that after the war the Soviet Union should incorporate the portions of Poland that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact gave it, while Churchill opposed. Discussing the fate of the Balkans later in 1944, Churchill agreed to Stalin's suggestion that after the war Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Yugoslavia come under the Soviet sphere of influence, while Greece would come under that of the West. In 1944, the Soviet Union made significant advances across Eastern Europe towards Germany, including Operation Bagration, a massive offensive in the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic against the German army. In 1944, the German armies were pushed out of the Baltic states, which were then re-annexed into the Soviet Union. As the Red Army reconquered the Caucasus and Crimea, various ethnic groups living in the region, the Kalmyks, Chechens, Ingushi, Karachay, Balkars, and Crimean Tatars, were accused of having helped the Germans. Because of this, Stalin's government abolished their autonomous republics, and between late 1943 and 1944, the majority of the populations were deported to Central Asia and Siberia. Over 1 million people were deported. In February 1945, the three leaders met at the Yalta Conference. Roosevelt and Churchill conceded to Stalin's demand that Germany pay the Soviet Union $20 billion in reparations, and that the Soviet Union should be allowed to conquer Sakhalin and the Coral Islands in exchange for entering the war against Japan. An agreement was also made that the new Polish government should be a coalition consisting of both communist and conservative elements, as if that ever worked out. Privately, Stalin wanted to ensure that Poland would come fully under Soviet influence. The Red Army refused helping Polish resistance fighters fighting the Germans in the Warsaw Uprising, Stalin believing that any victorious Poles could stop his plans to dominate Poland through a future communist government. Who, hiding his desires from the other Allied leaders, Stalin placed great emphasis on capturing Berlin first, believing that this would enable him to bring more of Europe under long-term Soviet control. Churchill was concerned that this was the case and unsuccessfully tried to convince the United States, which seems to actually be pretty pro-Soviet, that the Western Allies should pursue the same goal. In April 1945, the Red Army seized Berlin. Hitler committed suicide and Germany surrendered. Stalin was annoyed that Hitler was dead, having wanted to capture him alive. He ordered his intelligence agencies to secretly bring Hitler's remains to Moscow, seeking to prevent any physical remains becoming a relic for Nazi sympathizers. As the Red Army had conquered German territory, they discovered the extermination camps that the Nazi administration had run. Many Soviet soldiers engaged in looting, pillaging, and rape, both in Germany and parts of Eastern Europe, and Stalin, being a good man, refused to punish the offenders. With Germany defeated, Stalin switched his focus to the ongoing war with Japan, transferring 500,000 troops to the Far East. Stalin was aware that the United States had developed nuclear weapons, with which it wanted to defeat the Japanese, and was determined to enter the war before he could be denied the territories promised to him. On August 8th, in between the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet army invaded Japanese Manchuria and defeated the army there. These events led to the Japanese surrender and the complete end of World War II. Soviet forces continued to expand until they occupied all their territorial concessions, but the United States rebuffed Stalin's desire for the Red Army to take a role in the occupation of Japan by the Allies. Stalin went to the Potsdam Conference between July and August 1945, along with the new British and American leaders, Prime Minister Clement Attlee and President Harry Truman, respectively. At the beginning of the conference, Stalin repeated previous promises to Churchill that he would refrain from a Sovietization of Eastern Europe, which he totally kept that promise. Stalin pushed for reparations from Germany without caring about the German citizens' survival, which worried Truman and Churchill, who thought that Germany would become a financial burden for Western powers. He also pushed for war booty, which would permit the Soviet Union to directly seize property from conquered nations without limits. Hmm, totally not exploitation. Anyway, Germany was divided into four zones: Soviet, American, British, and French for some reason, even though all they did was surrender during the war. With Berlin itself located within the Soviet area, also subdivided in the same way. After the war, Stalin was at the apex of his career. Within the Soviet Union, he was widely regarded as the embodiment of victory and patriotism, because if you didn't see him that way, you were killed. His armies controlled Central and Eastern Europe up to the River Elbe. In June 1945, Stalin stood atop Lenin's mausoleum to watch a celebratory parade led by Zhukov through Red Square. Despite his strengthened international position, Stalin was cautious about internal dissent and desire for change among the population. He was also concerned about his returning armies who had been exposed to a wide range of consumer goods in Germany, much of which they had looted and brought back with them. He ensured that returning Soviet prisoners of war went through filtration camps as they arrived in the Soviet Union, in which 2.7 million people were interrogated to determine if they were traitors. About half of them were then imprisoned in labor camps. The Baltic states, where there was much opposition to Soviet rule, dekulakization and declericalization programs were started, resulting in 142,000 deportations between 1945 and 1949. Now, despite this amazing victory, however, only 26 to 27 million Soviets had died. So, no, not too many, with millions more being wounded, malnourished, or orphaned. Post-war Soviet society was more tolerant than its pre-war phase in many ways. Stalin allowed the Russian Orthodox Church to keep the churches it had opened during the war. Academia and the arts were also allowed greater freedom than they had before 1941. Recognizing the need for drastic steps to be taken to stop inflation and promote economic regeneration, in December 1947, Stalin's government devalued the ruble. Capital punishment was abolished in 1947 but reinstalled in 1950. Stalin's health was deteriorating, and heart problems forced a 2-month vacation in the latter part of 1945. He grew increasingly concerned that senior political officers, political and military figures might try to overthrow him, so he prevented any of them from becoming powerful enough to rival him and had their apartments bugged with listening devices. He demoted Molotov and increasingly favored Beria and Malenkov for key positions. In 1949, he brought Nikita Khrushchev from Ukraine to Moscow, appointing him a Central Committee secretary and the head of the city's party branch. In the Leningrad affair, the city's leadership was purged because of accusations of treachery. Executions of many of the accused took place in 1950.